guys still hear me?
Yes.
Anyone in the back, if you can't hear me, tell me so now. Okay, good. I like to move around. All right. Once upon a time, there was a young queen who sat sewing by her window on a snowy winter's day. And she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell into the snow on her windowsill. And she thought to herself, if only I could have a child who was as white as snow, and as red as blood, and as black as the wood of this window frame. Well, a short time later, she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, and she was as white as snow, and as red as blood, and as black as ebony wood. And the queen named her Snow White, and then died having given birth to her. Well, a year later, the king took for himself a new wife, and she was a beautiful woman, but she was also vain and arrogant. And she had a magic mirror, and every day she would stand before her mirror and she would say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror would reply, "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." And she would be satisfied, for she knew the mirror only spoke the truth. Well, the years went by, and on Snow White's 7th birthday, the queen once again stood before her mirror and asked her question. But this time, the mirror replied, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but young Snow White is yet more fair than you." And she became green with envy, and she knew that she would have no rest until Snow White was dead. So she called to her side a huntsman, and she told him to take Snow White out into the forest and to kill her and bring back her heart as proof that she was dead. So the huntsman did as he was told, and he led Snow White deep into the forest, and he took out his knife and was just about to plunge it into her heart when Snow White fell to the ground and began to weep and begged for him to have mercy. And she looked so lovely that the huntsman had to take pity on her, and he told her to run off into the woods and never, ever come back. So the huntsman began to return to the castle, and a wild boar crossed his path, and he killed the wild boar instead and cut out its heart. And when he returned to the castle, he presented the boar's heart to the queen as proof that Snow White was dead. And the queen gave it to her chef and had it cooked up with a little salt and pepper, and she ate it for her dinner that night, believing that she ate the heart of little Snow White. Because Grimm Brothers, love them. So meanwhile, Snow White ran through the forest very frightened, and she ran until it began to get dark. And she came across a little cottage. And she knocked at the door, but nobody answered, so she let herself inside. And there she found a little table with 7 little plates and 7 little cups. And she ate a little meat from each plate, and she drank a little wine from each cup. And then, feeling very tired, she went into the bedroom, and there were 7 little beds. And though she tried every bed, it wasn't until she laid down on the 7th that she felt it was just right, and she fell fast asleep. Well, later that night, the owners of the cottage returned, and it was the 7 dwarves who worked mining for gold in the mountains. And they were very surprised to find that somebody had been eating from their plates and drinking from their cups. And when they went into the bedroom, they saw the child sleeping there, and they thought that she was so lovely they couldn't stand to wake her. So instead, they just all stood over her and stared at her for a while. And eventually, Snow White woke up, and she was very frightened, because that's creepy. But the dwarves said, "Don't be afraid, child. Why have you come to our house?" And she told them the story of how her stepmother had tried to kill her. And the dwarves told her that she was welcome to stay and live with them, as long as she did the cooking and the cleaning and the mending and all of the things that a proper young girl should do. And Snow White, thinking that she wasn't going to get any better offers, agreed. So she decided to stay with the dwarves. Well, meanwhile, back at the castle, the next day, the queen once again stood before her mirror and once again asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror replied, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but over the mountains where the 7 dwarves dwell, little Snow White is still alive and well." And she became furious, realizing that the huntsman had tricked her. And so she determined that she would find a way to kill Snow White once and for all. So she dressed herself as an old peddler woman, and she traveled across the mountains until she arrived at the cottage. And she called out, "Wares for sale, beautiful wares for sale." And Snow White came to the door and asked what she was selling. And she pulled out the most beautiful silken stay laces that Snow White had ever seen, and she had to have them. So they agreed on a price, and the old witch said, "But you look a fright, child. You must let me lace you up like a proper young lady." And Snow White agreed, and the queen laced up her ties as tight as she could so that Snow White could no longer breathe, and she fell to the ground as if dead. Luckily, the dwarves arrived home a short time later and immediately saw what was the problem. So they cut off the stay laces, and Snow White was revived. And she told them what had happened, and they said, "It was none other than your wicked stepmother that tried to kill you. You must not let anybody else into the cottage." So Snow White agreed. Well, thanks to the magic mirror, soon after the queen realized that she had failed, and she concocted a new plan. Using the witchcraft that she knew, she created a beautiful diamond comb, but the tines of the comb were poisoned. And once again she traveled to the cottage, dressed as an old peddler woman, and called out, "Wares for sale?" And Snow White came to the window and said, "I'm sorry, but the dwarves have forbidden me to let anybody inside." And the witch said, "That's fine, I can show you what I'm selling from here." And she pulled out the comb, and it was the most beautiful comb that Snow White had ever seen, and she desperately wanted it. So they agreed on a price, and the witch said, "But you look a fright, child. You must let me comb your hair like a proper young lady." And Snow White agreed, and the queen began to comb her hair, but one of the poison tines pricked her scalp, and she fell to the ground as if dead. Luckily, the dwarves arrived home a short time later, and after inspecting Snow White's body, they found the comb, and as soon as they had pulled it out, she was revived. And the dwarves said, "Seriously, Snow White." And so she said, "Okay, I won't let anybody else in." Well, once again, the queen soon realized that she had failed, and this time she came up with a plan that she was sure would work. And she went into the lairs of the dungeons of the castle where she did her darkest deeds, and she created an apple that was poisoned on one half, and it was the most beautiful apple, and anybody who saw it would surely desire it. And then again, she traveled across the woods to the cottage, and she knocked at the door, and Snow White came to the window and said, "I'm sorry, the dwarves have forbidden me to let anybody in." And she said, "That's fine. I only wanted to see if you wanted this beautiful apple." And oh, it was the most gorgeous apple Snow White had ever seen, and she desperately wanted to eat it. She thought, "Man, I have had really bad luck lately with these old peddler ladies." And so she said, "I'm sorry, I really shouldn't, but thank you." She was polite. And the queen said, "But are you afraid of poison? Here, I will cut the apple in half, and I shall eat the white half, and you shall eat the red." And when Snow White saw that she was eating the apple, she thought surely it couldn't be poisoned. And Snow White took the poisoned red half, and she took a bite, and no sooner had it passed her lips than she fell to the ground dead. And the queen laughed in joy, for she had finally succeeded. And she returned to her castle, and stood before her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror replied, "You, my queen, are the fairest of all." And finally, her heart was at peace. Well, that night when the dwarves came home, they did everything they could to revive Snow White, but nothing worked. And they thought, surely she is dead now. And they sat over her and wept for 3 days. But she always went on as though she were merely sleeping. And the dwarves thought, well, we can't possibly bury her in the cold, dark ground. And being expert craftsmen, they made for her a glass coffin so that she could be seen from all sides. And they placed her in the meadow in the forest so that even the animals and beasts could come and mourn for her. And the years passed, and Snow White went on, always looking as though she were merely sleeping. Until one day, a prince happened to be wandering aimlessly through the forest. That's what princes do in fairy tales. And he came across Snow White's coffin, and he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he immediately